The 2nd of February, 1943. Snow falls in thin gray sheets over the fir trees surrounding Zossen, the underground command complex south of Berlin, where the Wehrmacht's high command has buried itself in concrete and cable. Inside, the air smells of damp wool, cigarette smoke, and the ozone tang of overworked teleprinter machines. A telephone rings somewhere down the corridor and is answered too quickly, too quietly. In a low-ceilinged room lit by a single hanging bulb, an intelligence officer of the Wehrmacht's Foreign Army's East Desk sits before a stack of decrypted signals and production estimates, his pencil frozen above a column of figures he has just finished totaling for the 3rd time. Outside, church bells in nearby villages have been ringing since dawn in mourning for the 6th Army, annihilated at Stalingrad the day before. 250,000 men gone into Soviet captivity or the frozen earth of the Volga. But it is not the casualty figures that have stopped this officer's pencil mid-stroke. It is a separate report, forwarded from Berlin's economic ministry, comparing German tank and aircraft production against updated estimates for the Soviet Union and the United States combined. He reads the totals again. He checks his arithmetic. The numbers do not change. Down the corridor, a duty clerk carries fresh dispatches from the Southern Front, boots echoing on bare concrete, and somewhere above ground, in the frozen villages of Brandenburg, farm carts still move slowly along rutted lanes as they have for generations, entirely unaware of the scale of what is being calculated below. The officer lights a cigarette with hands that are not quite steady, not from the cold, and reads the figures a 4th time regardless. Somewhere in that cold, humming room, a quiet and terrible realization begins to take shape, one that will spread through the German high command over the following 18 months, that the war they believed they were fighting, a war of maneuver, of daring, of superior soldiers and superior tactics, had already been decided somewhere else entirely, in blast furnaces in Michigan, in tractor factories relocated beyond the Urals, in shipyards on the Pacific coast working 3 shifts around the clock. This was no longer simply a war between armies. It had become a war between economies, and Germany, for all its early conquests, had entered it dangerously unprepared for that particular contest. To understand why this realization struck with such force, it is necessary to understand the war Germany believed it was fighting when it invaded Poland in September 1939. German planners had built their armed forces around the concept of Blitzkrieg, a doctrine relying on speed, concentrated armor, and close air support to achieve rapid, decisive victories before an opponent's larger industrial base could be mobilized. It had worked brilliantly against Poland, then France, in campaigns lasting weeks rather than years. But Blitzkrieg was, at its heart, a strategy designed to avoid a long war of attrition, precisely because German planners understood, even before the first tanks crossed the Polish border, that Germany could not win a prolonged industrial contest against the combined resources of the world's larger economies. Hitler himself had gambled on short, sharp campaigns for this very reason. When the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 failed to deliver the swift collapse Berlin had anticipated, and when the United States entered the war that December, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the conflict Germany had structured its entire military and industrial planning to avoid became the only war left to fight. German war production in 1941 stood at roughly 11,000 tanks and self-propelled guns for the year. American production alone would reach nearly 29,000 tanks in 1943, while Soviet factories, many of them dismantled and shipped eastward by rail ahead of the advancing Wehrmacht in 1941 and reassembled in the Urals within weeks, were producing over 20,000 tanks annually by the same year. German aircraft production, though it would rise considerably under later reorganization, never approached the combined output of Allied factories, which by 1944 were producing aircraft at a rate exceeding that of Germany, Italy, and Japan together. There was also the matter of fuel. Germany possessed no significant domestic oil reserves of its own and depended heavily on Romanian crude from the Ploiești fields and on synthetic fuel produced through the costly Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius processes, a dependency that would later make those synthetic plants among the most heavily targeted sites in the entire Allied bombing campaign. The United States, by contrast, possessed vast domestic reserves and produced the majority of the aviation fuel used by every Allied air force throughout the war, a strategic advantage German planners had underestimated from the outset. Existing German tactics, however brilliant on the battlefield, could not compensate indefinitely for an opponent who could simply replace every destroyed tank, aircraft, and lorry faster than Germany could destroy them, nor for an opponent whose fuel supply never approached exhaustion in the way that Germany's increasingly did from 1944 onward. The problem, by early 1943, appeared almost mathematically insoluble, and those inside the high command who understood the figures fully knew it long before the phrase was ever spoken aloud to Hitler himself. The man Germany turned to in an attempt to close this gap was Albert Speer, appointed Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production in February 1942, following the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt, in an aircraft accident. Speer, an architect by training with no prior experience in industrial management, approached the German war economy with a ruthless, almost engineering-minded clarity that had been largely absent under the fragmented competing bureaucracies that preceded him. He discovered, to his own astonishment, that German industry in 1942 was still operating on something close to a peacetime footing, with consumer goods production continuing alongside military output, women largely excluded from armaments factories for ideological reasons that Nazi leadership proved reluctant to abandon, and a chaotic system of overlapping military and civilian procurement agencies, each competing for the same raw materials and skilled labor. Speer's reforms, centralizing production planning, standardizing designs to reduce retooling time, and ruthlessly prioritizing raw material allocation toward armaments, produced a genuine transformation. German tank production nearly tripled between 1941 and 1944, rising from roughly 3,400 units to over 19,000 across all types that year. This achievement, remarkable under sustained Allied bombing of German industrial centers including the Ruhr Valley, Schweinfurt, and later the synthetic fuel plants that Speer himself considered the most critical target of all, demonstrated genuine organizational brilliance. Historians continue to debate how much of this increase reflected true efficiency gains against how much simply reflected Germany finally mobilizing resources that Britain and the Soviet Union had committed to total war production years earlier. What is not disputed is that even Speer's most extraordinary achievements arrived years too late and remained dwarfed by what the American economy alone could produce, almost as an afterthought, while also supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease agreements that shipped over 400,000 lorries, nearly 13,000 armored vehicles, and vast quantities of aviation fuel, machine tools, and locomotives to Soviet forces between 1941 and 1945. Speer himself would later write, in memoirs composed after the war and studied carefully by historians ever since, that he understood by 1943 the war was economically unwinnable, though he continued to serve Hitler for 2 further years regardless, a contradiction that biographers and historians continue to debate to this day. He introduced standardized tank designs to reduce the retooling delays that had plagued German factories, expanded the use of forced and slave labor drawn from occupied territories and concentration camps, a grim and well-documented reality without which German production figures for 1944 could not have been achieved, and pressed for the conscription of women into war industries against considerable ideological resistance from within the Nazi Party itself. Resistance that meant Germany never mobilized female labor to anything like the extent achieved in Britain or the Soviet Union. Even so, records suggest that German industry, for all its improvisation, never solved its most basic constraint, which was simply the size of the economy attempting to support it. The scale of American industrial conversion, once it began in earnest, is difficult to overstate even in retrospect. Detroit's automobile manufacturers, including Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, halted civilian car production entirely in early 1942 and converted their assembly lines to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and lorries at a rate that stunned even American planners. The Willow Run plant near Ypsilanti, Michigan, built by Ford specifically to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber, eventually achieved a production rate of one completed aircraft roughly every 63 minutes at its peak in 1944. Employing manufacturing techniques borrowed directly from automobile assembly lines and applied, for the first time, to a four-engined heavy bomber measuring over 67 feet in length. American shipyards, meanwhile, constructed Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels nearly 442 feet long, at a pace that reduced construction time from an initial average of over 200 days to, in one publicized case, under 5 days for a single vessel, though a fortnight to 3 weeks remained typical for the roughly 2,700 Liberty ships eventually built. These were not weapons in the conventional sense. They were the arteries through which every other weapon reached the battlefield, and Germany possessed no comparable capacity to interdict them once American shipyards reached full stride, despite the considerable success of German U-boats against Allied shipping earlier in the war. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. This industrial disparity translated into direct, measurable battlefield consequences that German commanders witnessed firsthand and reported with mounting alarm. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers advancing or retreating across the vast distances of Ukraine and Belarus increasingly encountered Soviet units equipped with American-built Studebaker US-6 lorries, over 100,000 of which were supplied through Lend-Lease and became so central to Soviet logistics that Red Army soldiers nicknamed them affectionately after the manufacturer. German field reports from 1943 onward repeatedly noted the mobility these vehicles granted Soviet forces, allowing rapid repositioning of artillery and infantry that German logistics, still reliant heavily on horse-drawn transport even late in the war, struggled to match. In the West, following the Normandy landings of June 1944, German commanders such as Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reported to Berlin that Allied material superiority in aircraft, artillery shells, and fuel had rendered conventional counterattack increasingly futile, regardless of the tactical skill of the troops involved. Exact figures for relative artillery shell production remain disputed among historians owing to incomplete German wartime records, though surviving Reich Ministry documents suggest Allied forces in Northwest Europe frequently maintained ammunition expenditure rates several times greater than what German artillery units could sustain by late 1944. The psychological impact on German troops, many of whom had been raised on newsreels celebrating the invincibility of German engineering, proved corrosive. Veterans' accounts collected after the war describe a dawning, unspoken dread among ordinary soldiers who found that no matter how many Allied tanks or aircraft they destroyed, more arrived within days, while their own losses grew increasingly difficult to replace. Comparing the industrial mobilization of the major combatants reveals a pattern that runs deeper than simple factory output. Britain, despite its comparatively small population and limited raw materials, had committed to a total war economy from 1940 onward, directing an extraordinary proportion of national output toward aircraft production that allowed it to outproduce Germany in fighter aircraft during the Battle of Britain and sustain that advantage through the war's middle years. The Soviet Union achieved perhaps the most remarkable feat of industrial relocation in modern military history, dismantling over 1,500 factories in 1941 and transporting them beyond the Ural Mountains, often reassembling production lines within weeks under open skies before roofs had even been completed, driven by the understandable terror of German conquest. The United States, protected by two oceans and possessed of the largest industrial base on Earth, converted its economy with a completeness that neither Germany nor Japan ever matched, in part because Allied strategic bombing, however costly to aircrew, never approached American industrial centers at all, while German cities endured sustained destruction that disrupted production even under Speer's reforms. Germany, by contrast, delayed full economic mobilization until 1942. Constrained by ideological reluctance to conscript women into factory labor on the scale Britain and the Soviet Union achieved, by Hitler's early confidence in quick victory, and by a fractured administrative system that took Speer nearly 2 years to meaningfully unify. This was not a difference in engineering talent. German designs, including the Panther and Tiger tanks, often demonstrated genuine technical superiority over their Allied counterparts in armor thickness and gun caliber, with the Tiger's 88mm main gun capable of destroying most Allied tanks well beyond the range at which they could effectively reply. Yet reliability told a different story. American Sherman tanks, though comparatively lighter and less heavily armored, were mechanically dependable, simple to repair in the field, and available in overwhelming numbers, with total wartime production exceeding 49,000 units against a few thousand Tigers and Panthers combined. Soviet T-34 tanks achieved a similarly formidable balance of simplicity, mobility, and sloped armor, produced by the tens of thousands even as factories operated in makeshift conditions beyond the Urals. It was, in the end, a difference in the capacity to build enough of anything fast enough and reliably enough for long enough to matter on a battlefield stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Volga. The wider historical impact of this economic dimension of the Second World War reshaped military thinking for the remainder of the 20th century. Cold War planners on both sides of the Iron Curtain absorbed the lesson thoroughly, structuring their defense industries and strategic doctrines around sustained industrial capacity, rather than assuming any conflict between major powers could be resolved quickly through tactical brilliance alone. The concept of the military-industrial complex, later named explicitly by American President Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell address of 1961, drew directly from the wartime experience of coordinating government, industry, and military planning at unprecedented scale. Economic intelligence, the careful study of an adversary's productive capacity rather than merely its order of battle, became a permanent and central feature of strategic planning, a direct descendant of those grim production estimates studied at Zossen in the winter of 1943. Surviving artifacts of this industrial contest remain scattered across museums and preserved sites today, from a Willow Run-built B-24 Liberator restored and displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, to Studebaker lorries preserved in Russian military museums bearing testament to the Lend-Lease program, to the remains of German synthetic fuel plants whose ruins near Leuna and Pulitz still mark where Allied bombers targeted the resource, Speer himself considered irreplaceable. Historians continue to debate the precise weighting of factors that determined the war's outcome, and no single explanation, whether Soviet manpower, Allied strategic bombing, or American industrial output, can claim sole credit. What the surviving evidence does confirm is that industrial capacity became, for the first time in a conflict of this scale, as decisive as any battlefield maneuver. Return, for a moment, to that underground room at Zossen, to the officer with his pencil frozen above a column of figures that refused to change no matter how many times he checked them. He could not have known, in that instant, the full weight of what those numbers represented. He could not have foreseen Willow Run's bombers rolling off the line at the rate of 1 every 63 minutes, nor the Studebaker lorries grinding westward across the Ukrainian steppe, nor the Liberty ships sliding into gray Atlantic waters faster than German U-boats could sink them. But in that quiet moment of arithmetic, something had already shifted, an understanding that would spread slowly through the high command over the following months and years, that Germany had entered a contest it could not win through courage or ingenuity alone. This was never simply a story of tanks and aircraft, of calibers and production totals, however precisely those figures can now be documented. It was a story of what happens when a nation built its strategy around the avoidance of a certain kind of war, only to find that war forced upon it regardless, against opponents whose factories, farmland, and shipyards could outlast anything the battlefield alone might decide. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is not that German engineers lacked brilliance, for Panther tanks and Messerschmitt jets, among the first operational jet aircraft in history, proved they did not. It is that brilliance, however considerable, could not manufacture time, nor multiply itself fast enough against economies that had chosen, years earlier and with far less hesitation, to convert every furnace, every assembly line, and every willing pair of hands toward a single, terrible purpose. There is no surviving evidence that the officer at Zossen ever recorded his private thoughts that morning, no diary entry, no post-war testimony describing the moment in his own words. What survives is only the outline of the war that followed, the burned-out tanks left across the steppe near Kursk, the wrecked synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, the endless columns of Studebaker lorries rolling toward Berlin from the east, while American bombers filled the skies from the west. Historians will continue to weigh each factor against the others, the courage of individual soldiers, the errors of individual commanders, the brutal calculus of manpower and geography, and none of these explanations, on its own, is complete. But taken together, they describe a war in which the outcome was never solely decided by the men who fought it, however extraordinary their sacrifice, but by the furnaces, shipyards, and assembly lines working quietly, relentlessly, far from any battlefield, long before the first shot of any given campaign was fired. In the end, the war was decided as much in Michigan and the Urals as it ever was in Normandy or Kursk, a truth the officer at Zossen glimpsed first in a column of figures on a cold February morning, long before the guns finally fell silent, and long before the world fully understood that industry, as much as courage, had written the outcome of the 20th century's greatest conflict.